Hello and welcome to our fourth set of notes in the social psychology unit where we are going to talk about pro-social relations. If you remember in the last video, we talked about anti-social relations. So it's kind of flipping the coin here and talking about relations and behaviors amongst people that promote positive social interaction. So make sure that you've got the paper notes that I've created and put at the link below this video in my Teachers Pay Teachers store. And let's go ahead and get started. The basis and really foundation of any pro-social behavior and relations is this term. It's a huge vocabulary term, altruism. Altruism is the unselfish regard for the welfare of others, right? It's doing things not because you're doing it for yourself, because you're doing it for others. And that's the unselfish part, right? So I actually have some resources on these slides. These slides, by the way, are also available in my Teachers Pay Teachers stores if you wanted to access them. But I've included some links here in that there is an organization or a foundation called the Random Acts of Kindness. And there's actually quite a few, there's like a movement that's happening around really positive psychology and acts of kindness towards other people. They have a calendar based off of each month. And things that you can do, kind of suggestions on random acts of kindness. And so in the slides, I have that linked for you, but you could also find their website at the Random Acts of Kindness, their foundation. So just like we talk about influences on conformity and influence on obedience in past videos and notes, we need to talk about influence on this idea of altruistic behavior. So there's a theory, it's called the social exchange theory, where the decision to help another person is based off of essentially the cost to risk ratio. So people think to themselves, how much is this going to cost me in comparison to how much it will help the person being helped? So like I said, it's like the risk to reward ratio. Now, reciprocity norm is the expectation that we should return help, not harm, to those who have helped us. Does that make sense? So if someone has helped us in the past or is currently helping us, the reciprocity norm says that you don't then harm that person. This seems like one of those terms in psychology that do we really have to put a name to it? Like that's kind of what you hope for humanity, right? And then there's the social responsibility norm, and that it's largely learned. It's a norm that tells us to help others when they need us, even though they may not repay us in kind. In that you see someone on the side of the road with a flat tire and it's obvious they don't know what they're doing. You happen to have all the tools that they need, as well as the skill to change their tire. So without the expectation that they are going to return directly to you any favors, you help them. So reciprocity being, I'm not going to harm anyone who helps me. Social responsibility being, we have a responsibility to the greater social workings of life. And so you're hopeful that other people will help you. So you help them when you're able to. So let's talk about influencing factors on this whole social exchange theory. All three of those terms kind of contributing all back to social exchange theory. The clarity for need of help is huge, in that the more obvious the need for help, the more obvious it is that an individual needs your help or needs anyone's help, the more likely help will be given most of the time, right? If you have to question in your brain, well, maybe do they really need help? If you have to question it, you are much less likely to help. But if it's super obvious, right, the more obvious it is that they need help, the more quickly even someone is going to rush to their assistance. Okay, so we need to consider one specific case when it comes to social exchange theory, this idea of altruism, and really what happened around this case in 1964 in Queens, New York. It's a case that we're known because of the victim. Her name was Catherine or Kitty Genovese. And she was getting home late at about 3:15 a.m., March 13th, 1964, from her late shift at work. She was a bartender in Queens, New York. Walking from her car to her apartment building in the parking lot, right? She's going home. She's done with work. She parks her car. She's going to her apartment building. The suspect, who was then convicted's name was Winston Mosley. The attack lasted 32 minutes. So what I've done here is kind of zoomed out so that I can read you more specifics of the story, just in case your teacher doesn't read it in class. But it's also good for you to go back to class the next time after that you're needing to have this information to just know this story. So I've got it down here for you. So she walked the 20 feet from the parking lot to her door, and a man named Winston Mosley, as we discussed, attacked her, stabbing her. Kitty cried out, "Oh my God, he stabbed me, please help me." Numerous neighbors heard this, later reported hearing the attack. Many coming to look out their windows. One neighbor even called out of his window, "Let that girl alone." At this call, Mosley left Kitty lying on the pavement. The apartment complex became still. Kitty struggled to her feet, bleeding badly from several stab wounds, and made it to her side of the apartment complex to a locked door. She grabbed the wall for support. Approximately 5 minutes after the first attack, Mosley returned and began stabbing Kitty again. She cried out, "I'm dying, I'm dying." Right? So very audible, very loud. Again, other people in the complex heard her, lights come on, windows open. People watched the scene from their apartments. Mosley fled a second time. This time, witnesses said, to a white Chevy and appeared to drive away. At 3:25, so this is 10 minutes later, Kitty, bleeding profusely from her wounds, stumbled to the rear of her building, tried to enter through the back door. It was locked. She slid along the wall until she reached a hallway leading to the second floor, falling to the floor at the entrance to the hall. Mosley returned a third time, following the trail of blood to where she lay bleeding on the floor. While she lay semi-conscious and incoherent, he sexually assaults her and stabbed her for the final 17th time, killing her and fleeing the scene. The entire event lasted 32 minutes. About 3:50 a.m., a neighbor of Kitty's called the police. Before doing so, he called a friend and asked what he should do. When the police began investigating, they discovered 38 people. 38 people who had heard or observed in some part of this fatal assault, and it took them that long to call the police, knowing what was going on. The attack lasted 32 minutes, 38 people. The New York Times later wrote an article, "The 37 who saw murder didn't call the police." And after that article was written, they found a 38th witness. And these 37 at the time witnesses were receiving death threats and awful letters in the mail because they said, how could you do this, right? So we bring this case up because of these influences, right? These influencing factors on the social exchange theory. And that most of the time, I went back a couple of slides, if there's a clarity for need, people will help, but not always. And that just really kind of hits you hard, almost like a gut check, right? The presence of others is also an influence on social exchange theory, and here's why. And I want you to really consider this with the Kitty Genovese case. So I'm actually going to skip diffusion of responsibility here for a second. I'm going to talk first about the bystander effect, and that both of these are really confusing, but you can't have one without the other, essentially. The bystander effect is the effect. It's just what happens. It's what we have found in research, what people do. It is not an explanation as to why. So the bystander effect is the tendency where, statistically speaking, as the number of people present increases, the likelihood that even one person will help decreases. So I want you to think of you're in the hallway at your school. And in our school, we have about 22-ish hundred students, right? So when the bell rings, there's over 2,000 children in the hallways at any given time. And one of them drops their books everywhere. According to the bystander effect, because there's so many students in the hallway, let's say it's a jam-packed intersection, the likelihood of that person being helped, of that student being helped, is very low because so many people are around. Now, why? Why in the world does this happen? Because of the cognitive process going on in every single one of the brains in that hallway. And that is diffusion of responsibility. So I'll say that one more time, and that the connection between these two is important for you to understand. The bystander effect just happens in that the more people there are, the less likely someone will get help. The reason why is because in every brain of the person observing and seeing this person need help is having diffusion of responsibility in their brains. So what this says is that as your brain is cognitively aware that more people are present, the responsibility for helping spreads amongst all of those present. So in your brain, you're rationalizing, well, there's a ton of people around, so somebody's going to help them, so I don't need to. Right? The one guy on the side of the highway who needs help with something, probably like a tire change or something like that. Well, it's a super busy highway at like rush hour. Someone's going to stop and help, so I don't need to. This is what's going through the minds as they are bystanders, right? Which then causes the tendency that is the bystander effect. Think of that in regards to Kitty Genovese. It's New York City, right? Millions of people. They all were committing diffusion of responsibility to create the bystander effect. And someone died because of it. The personality of the helper is really important, especially the mood of the person. So we have something called the feel-good, do-good phenomenon. And this is kind of in relation to something we talked about in the antisocial notes. But it's the tendency of people to be more helpful and altruistic to others when they are in a good mood, right? Especially if someone has just helped them. If someone has just helped them, they feel really good, right? And therefore they're like more likely to help other people. They don't have to have just been helped though. It could just be, ooh, I got a raise at work, or I found a really nice new coffee that I love and it just set my day out right, something like that. Other environmental factors are really, really influential. Just like other environmental factors are influential on antisocial behaviors. Being in a small town or rural area means you're more likely to get help. Not being in a rush or in a hurry, in that you can't use being in a rush as an excuse to not help someone. Nicer weather actually influences that. If it's a nice day out, they probably feel good, right? And therefore are more likely to help. And having just observed someone else being helped, or having just been helped themselves. And that kind of contributes to the feel good, do good as well. Some other theories include empathy altruism theory. This is where people help for completely altruistic reasons and are usually motivated by the desire to increase another person's well-being. And it depends upon how much empathy you have for someone, meaning your ability to put yourself into that person's shoes because you've experienced it yourself, right? That's huge. With empathy altruism, you've experienced something like that yourself, and you know what it feels like to be them right now. So you help them to increase their well-being. Evolutionary theory states that people help relatives, right? Blood, because it increases chances that the helper's genes will survive in the future. In a past unit, I believe it was in development, we discussed this in one of my past videos. You should totally check it out, the evolutionary theory of development. And this goes right along with it, right? Like our ultimate motivation in life is to spread our gene pool. And so if we help people who carry our genes, that's a really easy decision to help them. So what's the psychology around, we're kind of shifting gears here, attraction. So we're kind of done talking about altruism. Now we're going to talk about attraction. The environment has a lot to do with who you become attracted to and who you might end up spending the rest of your life with, let's say. Proximity is huge. And we'd like to say that things like long-distance relationships can last, which of course they can. But statistics show that proximity is huge. Geographic nearness is a powerful predictor of friendship. Very rarely do you find a couple who's been together or is together who live on opposite sides or even in different regions of the country. Mere exposure effect. I really like this one because I find it comical. So repeated exposure to novel, meaning new, stimuli increases one's liking of that item. So in other words, the more you are around someone new, the more you grow to like them. So the study that they did to show this was in a college class. maybe it was in a few college classes, but I know the story of there was one college class where it was the beginning of the semester, first ever class of the entire semester. And the professor had it set up to where, I don't know if it was a student, but just some other person put on a garbage bag, like a big garbage bag that covered most of their upper body, and just sat them in the back of the room. And they were there every single class period the entire time. And so what the professor did was gave a survey to all the other students who were not wearing a garbage bag at the beginning of the class and said, what do you think of the person in the back of the room wearing a garbage bag? And the results were kind of varied, but it essentially was like, oh, that's weird. Why is there a person wearing a garbage bag in this class? At the end of the course, remember, like a semester later, that's like, 4 or 5 months-ish, they did a survey again asking, what do you think of the person in the back of the room wearing their garbage bag? And almost everyone said, I kind of like him or her, whoever it is, right? Like they've been around this whole time. So just being exposed and around someone increases one's liking of that person, right? No interaction necessary, nothing, just being around. Time has an influence on attraction. You might want to take that into account the next time you go to ask her out. Just a thought. So the actual circumstances under which people first meet also influence attraction. So back here, we talked about proximity and being geographically near to someone has an influence, but how you meet for the first time and what that environment is like is really important. One is more likely to be attracted to a stranger you meet in comfortable rather than uncomfortable physical conditions. So, right, like at a party, right? Going out on a Friday night, that's a comfortable atmosphere, not in like a business meeting or, oh, heaven forbid it, like a funeral or something like that. Like, oh, that's such an awful how'd you meet story. But then attraction is also more likely if you associate someone with something pleasant. So that whole funeral thing is probably not something pleasant. So you don't want to meet the love of your life there because you're not associating something pleasant with them. But, like a baseball game or at a birthday party, something like that. That's more pleasant. Similarity is huge, right? So we talked about the environment with proximity. Now let's talk about similarity. Think two birds of a feather flock together, right? Birds of a feather flock together is kind of the idea here, but it's a little more specific and complicated with humans because everything's complicated with humans. So having similar views between individuals causes the bond of attraction to strengthen. But it doesn't mean that you have to be exactly the same, right? You just need to be similar in the big areas, such as, but not always or not limited to, religious views. And I'm sure you're like, whatever, that doesn't, what? I'm sure you know a couple that is strong in their relationship who are from different religions. I'm sure you do. But statistics show that that is not likely. Political beliefs are huge, and family values, like the decision on whether or not you're going to have children, but then from there, how you're going to raise them, how present you're going to be in their lives, those kinds of family values, how attached and close you are and connected you are to your parents still as an adult and your siblings and all that kind of thing. Those are important things. Just kind of a funny side note, they say that being a morning person or a night owl is also kind of like when you go to bed and when you wake up in the morning is also one of those bigger things, although not as important. Just something to consider. Physical attractiveness. Does it really matter? Yes. Yes, it does, but not always in the superficial, like really awful, vain way. It's especially important in the initial stages of a relationship. It is often what draws you to someone, right? And that you're not going to marry someone or spend the rest of your life with someone that you weren't first drawn to for some physical reason. And that before you got to know them, before you had a conversation, there was something about them that drew you to them. So yes, it's important, but it's not the end all be all. Now, there's something called the matching hypothesis, which I find super interesting. It states that people tend to date, marry, or form other committed long-term relationships with those who are similar in physical attractiveness to them. So to put it in short, that doesn't mean that we are all running for the Zac Efrons or the Selena Gomez's of the world, right? In my day, that's, Brad Pitt and I don't know, I guess Angelina Jolie, although that's not really a good one to use anymore. But we're not all running for those people, and here's why. Psychologists believe that it may really be more about compromise. There's that awful word that means you have compromised to end up with the person that you're spending the rest of your life with. Compromise as to why we pair off with someone of equal attractiveness rather than preference, which means we probably all prefer the Zac Efrons or the Selena Gomez's of the world, but we compromise. We are really attracted to those with the most physical appeal, but we don't want to be rejected by those people. We know we're going to be rejected by those people, so we settle for someone who's more like us and is more fair game, right? More of a match for us. So this seems all dark, grim, and awful, but I feel like it's also kind of going back to, does physical attractiveness really matter? And that we don't all have to be the Angelina Jolies and Brad Pitts of the world, right? That's not what it's about. Okay, so now we need to kind of talk about the phases of intimate relationships. And it starts with passionate love. This is an aroused state of intense positive absorption in another person, usually present at the beginning of a love relationship, right? You start with this super intense passion. I can't stop thinking about you. Don't ever leave my side. Passionate love. So when you are all consumed with thoughts of that person, oh, I can't stop thinking of you when you text them, right? Like that's the passionate love, and it's at the beginning of a relationship. Then it moves into a more compassionate love. This is the deep, affectionate, intimate attachment marked by mutual concern for the welfare of the other. It is less arousing, but psychologically is much more intimate than passionate love. And when we're talking about arousing, I don't necessarily only mean sexual arousal, although that is kind of involved here. It's also just overall nervous system heightened arousal around, oh, that person's in the room and you pay attention, right? And that, as soon as they walk in the room, you have noticed. That doesn't happen as much with compassionate love. But like I said, there's more of a psychological intimacy. It includes items like, and there's two here, equity. When one receives what he or she gives to the relationship, there can be compassionate love, and that I understand that I'm giving so much to this relationship and they are too. So you have to stand back and look at the relationships in your lives or of those that you have read about in books or seen in movies that are less healthy and therefore don't have this compassionate love. And that if he, let's say, is giving it all that he's got, is wanting to spend evenings and weekends with her, and she's like, nah, when I get to you, I'll get to you. There's some inequities there, right? There's not an equalness of both sides giving to the relationship. And then self-disclosure. This is being vulnerable, right? Revealing intimate details about yourself is huge because that's what allows for that psychological connection to happen. So compassionate love is really what's left over when the passion changes or dissipates. In that it does. In longer-term relationships, it dissipates because that's not what allows you to be in a relationship long term. It's this compassionate love. Sternberg came up with this triangular theory of love. And I'm just going to pause it here and allow you to kind of see that there are multiple components. So there are the corners, right? The corners being liking and intimacy, empty love and commitment, and infatuation and passion, and that you're anywhere in between those. But then in between, on the lines of the triangle, you have romantic, passion, and intimacy, right? So it includes both of those two. Companionate, meaning intimacy and commitment, and then fatuous love being passion and commitment. And then in the center is really what you're what you're wanting is the consummate love of intimacy, passion, and commitment, and that you have all of those. So Sternberg is essentially just saying this is what it takes. You want to be at the center of the triangle and having a good balance of all of the things on the outside of the triangle. You want to have all three of those, the intimacy, passion, and the commitment for a solid, intimate relationship. So that wraps up our pro-social relations notes. Stay tuned for the last set of notes that we got, and everybody have a great day.